I'd always thought my life with Clara was a quiet masterpiece, painted in steady strokes of trust and routine. 20 years married, 2 kids grown and off to college, and a house in the suburbs that smelled faintly of her lavender candles. She was a librarian, soft-spoken, glasses perched on her nose, the kind of woman who'd blush at a raised voice. I worked construction, hands rough from years of laying brick, but she'd still hold them like they were fragile. We were comfortable, predictable. That's what I loved about us. Started with the phone. Not hers, mine. A notification pinged late one night, an email from an address I didn't recognize. You deserve to know. Attached was a video, grainy but unmistakable. Clara, my Clara, in a dimly lit room I didn't recognize, laughing in a way I hadn't heard in years. She was with someone. A man. Not me. They weren't just talking. Her hands were on him, her lips brushing his ear, and then the screen cut to black. My chest tightened like a vice. I watched it again, and again. The timestamp said it was 3 weeks ago. I didn't confront her that night. I sat in the dark, the glow of my phone burning my eyes, replaying every moment of our life together. Was it real? Was she real? The next morning, she kissed my cheek and handed me coffee like always. I smiled back, but it felt like a mask. I needed answers. Not from her, not yet. I forwarded the email to a buddy, Mike, who'd done some PI work on the side. Find out who this guy is, I said. He didn't ask questions. Days passed. Clara hummed in the kitchen, oblivious. I started noticing things, her phone staying face down, her leaving the room to take calls, the faint scent of cologne on her scarf that wasn't mine. Mike called a week later. His name's Daniel Voss, local artist. Teaches at that community center she's been volunteering at. They've been meeting up for months. Months. The word hit like a sledgehammer. I thanked Mike and hung up, my hands shaking. That night, I watched her sleep, wondering how someone so familiar could feel like a stranger. Daniel Voss. I looked him up. 42. Unmarried. With a smug Instagram full of abstract paintings and shirtless selfies. He had a lean frame, sharp cheekbones, and a grin that screamed arrogance. Clara had mentioned him once, casually, said he was talented and fun to work with. I nodded, unbothered. Now it gnawed at me. I drove by the community center the next day, parked across the street, and watched. She was there, laughing with him outside, her hand brushing his arm. My knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. I didn't want to believe it was physical. Not at first. Maybe it was emotional, an infatuation, a midlife crisis. But the video looped in my head. Her lips too close, her body too willing. I needed proof. I bought a small camera online, the kind you hide in a smoke detector. Installed it in our bedroom while she was at book club. 2 days later, I got my answer. She didn't bring him here, thank God. But she stood in front of our mirror, adjusting a dress I'd never seen. Red, tight, bold. Then she left, perfume trailing behind her. I followed her that night. She drove to a loft downtown, his place, I assumed. Parked a block away, I watched her disappear inside. Hours later, she emerged, hair mussed, lipstick gone. My stomach churned. I went home, poured a whiskey, and waited. When she walked in, she smiled, said she'd had a great night with the girls. I nodded, bile rising in my throat. The lie was so easy for her. I started digging deeper. Hacked her email, her password was still our anniversary. Found messages. Can't wait to see you again, he wrote. You make me feel alive, she replied. Alive? What was I then? Dead weight? I printed them all, every word, and kept them in a folder under the mattress. Evidence. Ammunition. I wasn't ready to confront her yet. I wanted her to feel safe, to keep going, so I could build something bigger. Something she'd never see coming. The betrayal wasn't just her with him, it was the details. She told him things about me, private things. In one email, she wrote, "He's steady, but he doesn't see me anymore." Steady. Like I was a piece of furniture. I'd spent years building a life for us, breaking my back so she could have her quiet dreams, and she traded it for this artist's cheap flattery. I started tailing her more, learning their patterns. Tuesdays and Thursdays, she'd volunteer late. Sundays, she'd run errands. Each time she went to him, I met Mike again, this time at a diner. "I need more," I said. "Pictures, recordings, anything." He raised an eyebrow but nodded. A week later, he handed me a USB drive. Photos of them at a cafe, her leaning into him. Audio from a bug he'd planted in Voss's loft. Her voice, soft and giddy, saying things she hadn't said to me in decades. I listened in my truck, windows up, heat off, letting the cold sink in. It wasn't just physical. She loved him. That hurt worse than anything. I started planning. Not confrontation, something colder. I wanted her to lose everything, but not by my hand directly. I'd make it her own doing. I researched Voss more. Found his ex-girlfriend, a woman named Rachel, on social media. She'd posted cryptic rants about him, called him a manipulator, a liar. I messaged her, anonymous, asking for dirt. She replied fast, "He's a narcissist. Ruined my life. What's he done to you?" I didn't answer that. Instead, I asked for specifics. She sent stories. Debts he'd dodged, people he'd conned. Perfect. Clara noticed I was quieter. "You okay?" she asked one night, her hand on mine. I looked into her eyes, searching for guilt. "Nothing. Just tired," I said. She smiled, relieved, and went back to her book. I wasn't tired. I was awake more than ever, plotting. The folder under the mattress grew thicker, emails, photos, Rachel's messages. I wasn't sure what shape my revenge would take, but it was forming, sharp and heavy, like a blade I'd forge myself. I started testing her. Small things. "Met a guy named Daniel today," I said over dinner, casual. Her fork paused midair, just a second, before she smiled. "Oh? What's he like?" she asked, voice steady. "Arrogant," I said. "Thinks he's better than everyone." She laughed, too bright, and changed the subject. She was good at this, better than I'd ever imagined. Fueled me. I left fake clues. A receipt from a bar I didn't visit. A late-night work call I took in the garage. She never questioned them. Too busy with her own secrets, I guess. Mike got me into Voss's world. Turns out the guy had enemies, creditors, former students he'd stiffed. I contacted one, a guy named Paul, under a fake name. Said I was a concerned friend, looking to warn someone about Voss. Paul spilled. Voss had borrowed thousands for an art show that never happened. Left Paul hanging. I thanked him, filed it away. Leverage. I kept tabs on Clara, too. She'd started wearing brighter colors, humming more. She was blooming, and I was wilting, feeding off the rot she didn't see. I decided to meet Voss. Not as her husband, as someone else. I called the community center, said I was a contractor interested in art classes. He met me in his studio, all charm and paint-stained hands. "You've got a good eye," he said, showing me a canvas. I nodded, imagining those hands on her. He didn't know me, didn't suspect. I left with a handshake and a plan. That night, Clara came home late again, glowing. "Good day?" I asked. "The best," she said. I smiled, pouring her wine, my mind spinning. The revenge took shape slowly, deliberate, like laying bricks for a wall no one sees coming. I didn't want to just hurt her. I wanted her to unravel, to watch her world collapse under the weight of her own choices. I started with Voss. Using a burner phone, I sent anonymous tips to his creditors, little nudges about where he'd be. Paul got a call, too. Told him Voss was flaunting cash at the loft. Soon, I saw guys in cheap suits staking out his place. Clara came home rattled one night, said some creeps had hassled her outside the center. "Weird," I said, feigning concern. Next, I leaned on Rachel. Sent her a package, photos of Voss with Clara. No note. She'd connect the dots. 2 days later, Voss's Instagram went dark. Clara was quieter, distracted. "Something wrong?" I asked. "Just stress," she mumbled. I knew better. Rachel must have confronted him, stirred the pot. I kept the pressure on, feeding bits of Voss's past to anyone who'd listen. Online forums, art blogs, Even a local reporter I tipped off about his shady dealings. His name started popping up in ugly corners of the web. Clara's lies grew sloppier. She'd forget where she'd been, mix up stories. I played along, letting her dig deeper. One night, she didn't come home until 2 a.m. No excuse, just a tired, I lost track of time. I nodded, poured her tea, and watched her sip it, oblivious to the storm I was brewing. The folder under the mattress was a tome now. Proof of her betrayal, blueprints of their ruin. I wasn't done. This was just the foundation. The real cruelty, the part she'd never recover from, was still to come. Clara's world was fraying, and she didn't even know I was the one pulling the threads. Voss's life was crumbling faster now. Creditors hounding him, his art classes shrinking as rumors spread. I'd heard from Mike that the community center was considering dropping him. Good. I kept my hands clean, letting others do the dirty work. But Clara, she was still clinging to him, sneaking off, thinking I was blind. I wasn't. I'd planted a tracker in her car, a tiny thing from some tech site. Every move she made lit up my phone. She was at his loft again last night, 3 hours. I didn't sleep. I started leaving traps at home. A note on the counter. Forgot to tell you. Ran into Daniel Voss today. Strange guy. She read it when she got back, her face tightening for a split second before she smiled. Oh, really? How'd that happen? She asked, voice too high. Work thing. I lied. She nodded, but her eyes darted away. I let it sit, let her stew. Later, I accidentally left my laptop open to a search. How to tell if someone's hiding something. She saw it, hesitated, then closed it without a word. I watched from the hall, silent. Rachel was my next move. She'd gone quiet after the photos, but I needed her louder. I sent her another package. Audio clips from Mike's bug, Clara's voice laughing with Voss, calling him her escape. No return address, just a typed message. He's doing it again. 2 days later, Rachel showed up at the community center. I was parked nearby, saw her storm in, heard yelling through the open window. Clara came out after, pale, clutching her bag. She didn't see me. That night, she barely spoke, picking at her food. Rough day? I asked. Yeah, she muttered. I smiled, refilling her glass. The tracker showed her driving to Voss's less often now. Trouble in paradise, I guessed. I dug into her phone again, new messages. We need to be careful, she wrote. She's unhinged, he replied. Rachel was rattling them. Perfect. I wasn't done with her yet, though. I had bigger plans. Ones that'd make Clara feel every ounce of what she'd done to me, without me ever raising a voice. I wanted Clara to doubt herself, to question everything. I started small, moving things she'd sworn she'd left in place. Her keys on the wrong hook, her scarf missing then reappearing in the laundry. I'm losing my mind, she laughed one morning, searching for her glasses. They were in my pocket. I handed them over, all concern. You've been distracted lately, I said. She froze, then brushed it off. But I saw it, the flicker of fear. She was cracking. Voss's world kept shrinking. The reporter I'd tipped ran a piece. Local artist accused of fraud. Not big news, but enough to hit the community center's donors. They cut his program. Clara came home fuming that night, ranting about unfair gossip. I nodded, sympathetic, while my mind raced. She was still defending him, still tied to him. I upped the ante. Using a fake account, I posted the article on her library's staff forum, titled, Anyone know this guy? She'd see it eventually. She'd squirm. Rachel wasn't done either. I'd sent her one last nudge, a bank statement I dug up from Voss's trash, showing he drained her savings years ago. I added a note. He's using her now. Next day, Rachel showed up at Voss's loft. I watched from my truck as she banged on the door, screaming. Clara's car was there too. They both came out, Voss holding Clara's arm like a shield. Rachel lunged, shouting something I couldn't hear. Clara pulled away, stumbled to her car, and sped off. She got home an hour later, eyes red. Bad day? I asked. You have no idea, she snapped. I did, though. I knew it all. That night, I left the folder under the mattress sticking out. Just enough. She didn't notice. Too busy texting Voss, her fingers flying. I checked later. We need to stop. It's too much. His reply, don't give up on us. The word burned. I wasn't stopping either, not until us was ash in her hands. Clara was unraveling now, and I fed it. I'd call her from work, voice casual, asking about her day. She'd stumble over answers, mixing lies with half-truths. Just at the library, she'd say, while the tracker showed her downtown. I'd hum, let it hang, then change the subject. She started avoiding my eyes. Good. Doubt was her new shadow, and I was its architect. At home, I'd play music she hated, old jazz loud, watching her flinch. Thought you liked this, I'd say. She'd force a smile. She didn't. Voss was a mess too. Creditors had seized his car. I saw it towed while I happened to drive by. His loft was next, eviction notices taped to the door. I sent Mike to snap photos, slipped them to Rachel with a note. He's got nothing left. She posted them online, tagged him, called him a leech. Clara saw it. I caught her scrolling, face pale. Friend of yours? I asked, nodding at her phone. She slammed it down. No one, she said. Liar. I planted more seeds. Told her I'd been thinking about us lately. My tone vague. She tensed, asked what I meant. Just feeling distant, I said, watching her squirm. She reached for my hand. Too quick, promising we'd spend more time together. I nodded, let her think she'd dodged something. She hadn't. That night, she cried in the bathroom, thinking I couldn't hear. I didn't comfort her. Let her drown in it. The folder stayed out, a corner peeking. She found it the next morning. I'd timed it, left for work, but circled back. Through the window, I saw her open it, hands shaking as she read her own words, saw the photos, the proof. She sank to the floor, sobbing. I drove away, heart steady. She'd confront me soon, I knew. I was ready not to forgive, but to twist the knife deeper. She waited for me that night, folder in her lap, eyes swollen. What is this? She asked, voice trembling. I sat across from her, calm. What do you think it is? I said. She stammered. Apologies, excuses. It's not what it looks like. I laughed, cold. It's exactly what it looks like, Clara. She begged, said it was a mistake, that she'd end it. I already have. I lied. She didn't know the half of it. I took the folder, walked out, left her crying. Step 1. I didn't stop there. Voss was broke, desperate. I'd made sure of it. I called Paul, the creditor, from a burner. He's got cash stashed, I said, giving a fake address, our old storage unit. Paul raided it with some thug friends. Found nothing, of course, but trashed the place. Clara got the call next day. Panicked, said, someone broke in. I feigned shock. Who'd do that? I asked. She didn't answer, but I saw the gears turning. She suspected Voss's mess was bleeding into her life. It was. Rachel kept the pressure up. I'd leaked her Voss's new number, Clara's burner phone, actually. Rachel called nonstop, left voicemails Clara couldn't ignore. You're next, you homewrecker. Clara changed the number, but I had Mike get the new one. Fed it back to Rachel. The harassment doubled. Clara stopped sleeping, jumped at every ring. I catch her staring at me, searching for blame. I gave her nothing, just silence, letting her imagination run wild. Then I hit Voss directly. Forged a letter from Clara, mailed it to his landlord. He's dangerous. I'm scared. Get him out. Landlord bought it, started eviction proceedings. Clara came home ranting about lies ruining Daniel's life. Sounds rough, I said, pouring coffee. She glared, suspecting. She had no proof. I covered every track. She was trapped, and the walls were closing in. Clara broke first. I'm leaving, she said one morning, bags packed. I can't do this. I shrugged. Your call. She expected me to fight, to beg. I didn't. She hesitated, then left. I knew where she'd go, Voss. Perfect. I'd already tipped Rachel. They're together now at his place. Rachel showed up that night. I watched from across the street. Screaming, glass breaking. Clara ran out, Voss after her. Then Rachel, a tornado of chaos. Neighbors called the cops. Voss got hauled off for disturbing the peace. Clara drove away, alone. I didn't follow. I went home, poured whiskey, and waited. She'd be back. She had nowhere else. 2 days later, she was knocking, defeated. "Can we talk?" she asked. I let her in, silent. She spilled it all, Voss's lies, her regret. "I messed up," she sobbed. "You did?" I said, flat. She begged for forgiveness. I didn't give it. Instead, I handed her a lease, Voss's loft, in her name. I'd forged it, paid a month's rent with her card while she was distracted. "You wanted him. He's yours now," I said. She stared, horrified. She tried to explain, but I cut her off. "I'm done." I'd already moved money. Our savings split clean, half hidden where she'd never find it. She'd get the house, but I'd gutted it, sold furniture, canceled utilities, all legal. She'd walk into a shell. "You can't," she whispered. "I already have," I said, walking out. Revenge wasn't loud. It was quiet, precise, and hers to live with. Clara thought she could salvage something, me, herself, maybe even Voss. She was wrong. I'd already set the final pieces in motion. She stayed in the house after I left, rattling around in its emptiness. I'd sold the good stuff, her grandmother's china, the couch she loved, through a proxy, all cash, untraceable. Utilities were off. She'd have to beg the companies to turn them back on. Explain why her name was tied to late payments I'd forgotten to make. I moved into a cheap rental across town, watching from a distance. Voss was out on bail, but I wasn't done with him. I'd kept one ace. His old tax returns, snatched from his trash months ago. Sloppy guy, hadn't filed right in years. I sent copies to the IRS, anonymous, with a note, "Check Daniel Voss, local artist." They'd sniff around, find the debts, the lies. He'd drown in audits while Clara clung to him. I pictured her bailing him out with what little she had left, and it warmed me like the whiskey I sipped every night. She called me, voice shaky. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Doing what?" I said, calm. "The house, the money, everything's gone." I let silence hang. Then, "You chose this, Clara. Live with it." She cried, begged me to stop. I hung up. She didn't know half of it yet. Rachel was still in play, furious, relentless. I'd slipped her Clara's new number, said Voss gave it to me. The calls started again. Venomous voicemails Clara couldn't escape. I heard one when she played it on speaker, thinking I'd care. "You're as bad as he is, you thief." Clara sobbed. I didn't flinch. The lease was the kicker. She tried returning it, but the landlord, greedy, lazy, insisted it was hers. "Your signature," he said. "Forged, sure, but good enough." She was stuck paying for Voss's dump, bleeding cash she didn't have. I drained her accounts just enough. Small transfers, accidental subscriptions, to keep her scrambling. She'd figure it out too late. I slept sounder knowing she didn't. Clara tried to fight back. She hired a lawyer, some cheap guy from a strip mall ad, to untangle the lease mess. I'd expected it. The paper trail was tight, her card, her email, all pointing to her. The lawyer called me fishing. "Misunderstanding," I said, voice smooth. "She's been distracted lately. Check her story." He didn't push. Clara's version, wild, frantic, made her sound unhinged. The case fizzled. She was out $1,000 for nothing. Voss was sinking faster. The IRS let her hit, back taxes, penalties, a lien on anything he owned. He called Clara, desperate, asking for help. She told me later, thinking I'd soften. "He's got nothing," she said, eyes pleading. "Neither do you," I replied, walking away. She'd pawned her wedding ring. I saw it in a shop window, recognized the engraving. That stung, but only for a second. She'd chosen him over me. Now she'd carry him. I spread the rot wider. Sent Voss's landlord a tip. Clara's car. Parked there too often. Suspicious activity. Cops did a welfare check. Found Voss with some sketchy art supplies. Nothing illegal, but enough to spook the landlord. Eviction sped up. Clara showed up at my rental that night, furious. "You're ruining us," she yelled. "You ruined us," I said, shutting the door. She banged on it, neighbors watching. "Let them." She looked crazy, not me. Rachel kept the pressure on, too. I'd mailed her Clara's library schedule, public info, easy to find. She started showing up, glaring from across the street. Clara quit volunteering, scared. Her safe little world, books, quiet, was gone. I didn't feel sorry. I felt alive, watching her shrink, knowing every step she took was on ground I'd salted. Clara's life was a house of cards now, and I kept blowing. She moved in with Voss, into that rotting loft, thinking love would save them. Didn't. The landlord padlocked it a week later, unpaid rent, her name on the lease. They slept in her car, I heard, from a neighbor who'd seen them arguing in a parking lot. I drove by once, saw her curled in the passenger seat, Voss smoking outside. She looked hollow. I didn't wave. The IRS seized Voss's bank account, empty anyway, but the legal mess piled up. Clara's lawyer dumped her. She couldn't pay. She called me again, voice raw. "I'm sorry," she said, over and over. "Help me." I listened, let her ramble. Then, "You've got Daniel. Ask him." I hung up. She didn't call back. I knew she wouldn't. He had nothing left to give, and she was too proud to beg twice. I hit her where it hurt most, her reputation. She'd always been the good one, the librarian everyone trusted. I sent an anonymous email to her boss. Photos from Mike, her with Voss, time-stamped during work hours. "Thought you should know," I wrote. She got suspended pending review. Word spread, small town, big mouths. Friends stopped calling her. She'd built her life on being perfect. I made sure they saw the cracks. Rachel delivered the final shove. I'd given her one last gift, Clara's old diary, stolen from the house before I left. Pages about Voss, her gushing, her guilt. Rachel photocopied it, mailed it to Clara's coworkers, her family. Clara's sister called me, shocked. "Is this real?" she asked. "Ask her," I said. The fallout was quiet but brutal. Clara cut off, alone with Voss, a man who couldn't save himself, let alone her. They tried to run, packed what little they had, left town in her beat-up sedan. I'd anticipated it. The tracker was still active, showed them heading south, probably chasing some desperate dream. I didn't chase. I called a tow company instead, gave them her plate number, said it was abandoned at a gas station I knew they'd hit. Car got impounded, fees stacking up. They wouldn't get it back. She had no money, and Voss's credit was shot. I heard later they'd hitchhiked, landed in some nowhere motel. Voss tried selling paintings on the street, nobody bought. Clara took a job cleaning rooms, minimum wage, barely enough for food. I pictured her scrubbing stains, hands raw, thinking of the life she'd thrown away. I didn't gloat. I just nodded, satisfied. She'd wanted alive with him. Now she had it, dirty and small. Back home, I sold the house. Market was good. I made a profit, kept it all. Clara's name was off the deed. Divorce papers filed, uncontested. She didn't show up to sign, too broke to fight. I sent her half anyway. Pennies, really, after taxes and fees I'd padded. Let her think I was fair. The folder stayed with me, a trophy I'd never show. Every lie, every photo, proof I'd won. People asked about her, casual. "She's with someone," I'd say, shrugging. They'd nod, drop it. I rebuilt. New place, new crew at work. No trace of her lavender stench. She'd fade, a ghost in my rear view, while I kept moving. Revenge wasn't about her suffering. It was about me standing taller when she fell. Word trickled back months later. Clara and Voss, still together, barely. A friend of a friend saw them in a diner, her waiting tables, him sketching on napkins nobody wanted. She'd aged, they said, hair gray, eyes dull. Voss looked worse, thin and jittery, like the world had chewed him up. They fought in public, loud, over nothing. She'd cry, he'd storm off. Then they'd crawl back, stuck in their misery. I didn't smile when I heard. I just poured a drink, sat in my new chair, and let it settle. The library fired her after the review. Too much scandal. Her family cut ties. The diary was the last straw. Voss's art dried up. No galleries, no buyers, just a name tied to fraud and failure. The IRS took what little he had left. Clara's wages got garnished for the lease debt. They were shadows, clinging to each other because no one else would. I'd made sure of it. Not with fists or shouts, but with whispers, paper, patience. I saw her once, years later. Drove through that nowhere town, stopped for gas. She was outside a thrift store, selling clothes from a box. Didn't recognize me, didn't look up. I watched for a minute, her hands trembling as she counted change. Voss wasn't there. Gone, maybe, or just useless. She was alone, smaller than I remembered. I paid for my gas, drove off. No words, no glance back. My life's good now. Work steady, house is mine, no echoes of her. Friends say I'm quieter, but they don't pry. I don't need them to. Clara wanted something else. Something alive. I gave it to her, raw, ugly, permanent. She'll carry it forever, while I walk free. That's my revenge. Not her ruin, but her living it, every single day.